Mariah's son died of cancer 10 years ago, but she still visits his grave every day and keeps his bedroom exactly as he left it. She speaks of him in the present tense, and any reminder of his death sends her into a spiral of sobbing and despair. Her grief never softened, it only deepened. Welcome to this mini-series on understanding the language of grief, loss and trauma. My name is Nathalie Himmelrich. I'm a somatic practitioner, psychological therapist, educator and author, specialising in grief and trauma, and the host of the How to Deal with Grief and Trauma podcast. Grief and trauma are deeply human experiences, yet many of us struggle to describe what we are going through, or to understand what others are facing. The vocabulary of loss is vast, varied, and sometimes overwhelming. In this short podcast episode series, we'll explore the different types of grief, loss, and trauma that people encounter throughout life. Each mini-episode serves both as an educational tool and a compassionate companion for anyone trying to make sense of their own experience with grief, loss and trauma, or someone who is supporting someone else who is. These terms are more than labels. They are doorways into greater understanding, healing and connection. Whether you are a bereaved parent, a caregiver, a therapist, or someone walking alongside a grieving friend or someone who's experienced trauma, these bite-sized episodes aim to give you language, insight, and tools. Each one includes a definition, some key considerations, an explanation of why it matters, relevant podcast episodes, and frequently asked questions that I have been asked by my clients and you, the listener of the podcast. And my answers are all grounded in both professional and lived experience. So let's begin. So chronic grief is intense, long-lasting mourning that continues for years and interferes with daily functioning. It can be like an emotional wound that refuses to close. And people with chronic grief often remain emotionally tied to the loss in a way that keeps them from re-engaging with life. So chronic grief doesn't follow a timeline. The person may still be crying daily or avoiding social contact or unable to find joy in anything years after the loss. This is more than sadness. It can be an all-encompassing sorrow that makes daily tasks difficult. Often chronic grief is rooted in a particularly close bond or traumatic loss and may be exacerbated by lack of support or unresolved guilt. So this matters because recognizing chronic grief allows for a shift from judgment, like, why aren't they over this, to compassion. They're still hurting deeply. And it also signals that additional support may be needed, not to fix the grief, but to help the grieving person begin to carry it differently. So some examples that somehow be covered in the How to Deal with Grief and podcast are parents who mourn their child for over a decade, or stories of partner unable to form new relationships due to unresolved grief, or people who experience emotional relapses at every anniversary or season that makes them unable to cope. I'm looking forward to have more interviews also with therapists who work with long-term grief to give you an understanding of those kind of types of people dealing with that and how they are supported. So is chronic grief a mental illness? Not exactly. It is a natural grief process that hasn't softened over time, but it can overlap with depression or prolonged grief disorder. So what is the difference between normal grief and chronic grief? So normal grief if there is ever something like that. But the way this terminologically explained is normal grief gradually becomes more integrated. Chronic grief, however, stays sharp and raw even after many years. So can chronic grief ever go away? It may not disappear, but with support it can shift into a form of grief that is less intrusive and more integrated. So for those of you listening who are supporting others, the question that I've received is, should I encourage someone with chronic grief to move on? No. It's better to offer compassion, not pressure, because healing cannot be rushed. Integrating grief back into life is not something that needs to be rushed. What support works best? Gentle therapy, grief groups, somatic work, and rituals of remembrance, especially ones that honor the depth of the bond. And for those of you grieving, I have this question every time: how do I know if I have chronic grief? So if your grief still feels fresh after years, interferes with your daily functioning, or isolates you, you may be living with chronic grief. So find someone who is grief literate and check that out if you want to get some help. So can people with chronic grief still live fulfilling lives? Yes, they can. With care, acknowledgement, and support, many people learn to carry their grief in meaningful, manageable ways. So what if others think I'm grieving too long? That's a question that is often asked because people surrounding grievers often have an idea of how long grief should last or how it should be expressed. And what I say to that is, grief has no timeline. Trust your own process and seek support from those who understand. Again, I say it again and again, find someone who is really grief literate therapist, a grief understanding person, someone who understands it and is not trying to fix you. In the next episode, we're looking at exaggerated grief, so stay tuned. I hope this episode has helped you feel more grounded in the language of loss, grief, or trauma, and maybe even offered you some clarity, validation, or insight into your own experience or the experience of someone you care about. Grief and trauma are deeply personal, yet universal. When we can name what we're feeling, we take one powerful step closer to healing and the integration of our experience back into our life. If this series resonates with you, I invite you to keep exploring. You'll find more resources, courses, and ways to work with me at nathaliehimmelrich.com. And of course, you're always welcome to revisit any of the episodes whenever you need a gentle reminder that you're not alone. Until next time, take good care of your heart.